Another fold has been added into the conference realignment saga, as now apparently, according to Dennis Dodd, Oregon and Washington have been told by the Big Ten to stand by and wait as they are waiting to get word from the University of Notre Dame. Now, this has been an ongoing discussion for decades on if the University of Notre Dame should join a conference, if they will join a conference. A lot of the conference elitists, if you will, have always pushed to say that Notre Dame should have to be in a conference, especially in the current college football playoff era. It didn't matter as much when it was strictly just bowls and it was the AP voting on who was the national champion. It has been a much different era, and things have been progressing towards Notre Dame possibly having to join one. And we've gotten to this point now. And I said this yesterday when I reacted to the USC UCLA news. Notre Dame might not have a choice in the next 10 years on if they can join a conference or not, or rather, if they even want to or not. Notre Dame has always had one of the greatest advantages of having their own TV rights deal. And that is probably the biggest motivation for choosing to remain independent. They are the last remaining notable independent that anyone can think of. The BYU is the most recent one, and they are joining the Big 12. And that's not even that big of a brand compared to Notre Dame. But Notre Dame has significantly benefited from the financials of that NBC deal, not to mention not having to do a revenue split with any of the other teams in a conference. But we're now at this point as the first domino fell last year with Oklahoma and Texas joining the SEC. We have the next bigger domino of USC and UCLA completely throwing out the necessity for regionality for these conferences. Now that that is gone, there is an emphasis for the Big Ten and the SEC. They are going to be attacking, going and trying to fill these conferences into 20, 30 team conferences. It is inevitable. They are going to be pushing for as many big college football brands as possible. And the separate side note to this here is the fact that they're already talking to Oregon and Washington. So once the Notre Dame situation's figured out, they're already going to be going after two more big and the best remaining big brands in the Pac-12. But I honestly feel, and I'm a Notre Dame fan. I grew up a Notre Dame fan. My dad went to the University of Notre Dame. I spent multiple trips a year going and visiting the University of Notre Dame. And I have always agreed with the mentality that they do not belong in a conference. They benefit from the branding that has gotten them this far, that they don't need to be a part of a conference. And it would, in the past, mostly, would have been a detriment to the growth of their program. But now they are not likely going to have that choice. And I honestly think that it is better for them to make the first move now, as these conferences, either the SEC or the Big Ten or whatever the ugly Big 12, Pac-12 merger ends up becoming, the slappy 12, which we'll call it, when they are in this position where they're going to be pursued, and right now it is the Big Ten, they need to be one of the first teams to make this move, not the last, when they're going to have far less leverage. These super conference building processes are trying to go after the biggest brands to start. So Notre Dame in these negotiations on this decision are going to have leverage because they're one of the early brands to be pursued. But if after they filled out the remainder of their scheduling and their divisions, both these conferences figure out, or three conferences figure out what teams are going to be playing in them, and say that these teams, which there's a likelihood of this happening, deciding that there is going to be exclusivity in their scheduling, saying that you can't play anybody outside of your conference, or even if that doesn't happen, in order to qualify for the college football playoff, you need to have won your conference. Notre Dame, once it gets to that point, is going to be screwed. So right now, it makes sense for Jack Swarbrick, I think, to get ahead of the curve when they're being pursued heavily. Maybe they can maintain that NBC rights deal with having to be under the Big Ten network, which would be such a vast downgrade from having their own rights to being featured on NBC every single Saturday. And also, if we think about it, separate from the regionality of it, where they're located, it actually makes more sense than ever for them to join the Big Ten. And again, I feel I sound like such a hack that I'm completely turning around on how I've stood on this point for so long. But the more that I've thought over it the past couple of days, they are able to go into the scheduling, and I'm sure that this is part of the Big Ten's argument, is that you get to go back to playing and having access to playing all of the rivals that you played for so long in the 90s, the early 2000s, and even way before that, like Michigan State. You can play Michigan every single year now, which used to be a long-standing rivalry. They usually pretty consistently play Purdue as well, but the big one here is that they have the biggest rival that Notre Dame has had in the history of its program, now set to become a member of the Big Ten, that being USC. That should be the clear indicator is that you're or the clear argument point for the Big Ten is that they can say you can maintain all of these rivalries that have produced such tremendous TV ratings and notoriety for your football program. All of those things are going to be maintained. If anything, they're going to be bolstered with this new massive conference that the Big Ten is trying to build. The other thing, too, is Notre Dame has been kicking the crap out of a lot of these Big Ten teams most recently, especially Michigan, with the guys that they have pulled right under the clutches of Michigan, especially CJ Carr. The fact that they're competing and stealing guys that would be Big Ten recruits, I think fits even more why it makes sense. And also on top of that, why the Big Ten wants to go and get Notre Dame is so that they're not taking talent outside of the conference and it instead is going to be staying. A lot of things are going to come into play for this. I think Notre Dame is at a point now where this could happen soon, and I think that they should be one of the first teams to make the move instead of waiting until the end, until after everything else has happened, when they have less leverage when they're trying to go through these negotiations.